First and foremost, what did you make of what we just, the discussion we've just had about the hostages, for instance? Unclear from Mark Regev whether there is as much optimism as President Biden has suggested.
Well, we heard something which gave me a tiny bit of encouragement, which is, from everything we know, the kind of deal that's available now to get the hostages out was available 3 weeks ago, and perhaps some of the hostages have subsequently lost their lives in the Israeli attacks. However, if that's the victory narrative that the advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister, and by extension Israel, needs, if they need to say, despite what we know that it's not the case, if they need to say that only because of the ground incursion do we now have the ability to get them out, I think most people would say...
He didn't say just that, he said the entire campaign, the pressure.
I think he said the intensification of the pressure. There were a couple of other things that I found interesting. He acknowledged that prior to the ground invasion, they were not using surgical strikes, which is, of course, something that we've all seen. I think it's a shame when you hear the numbers being questioned. Mm-hmm. We've all seen the images. We know that in previous rounds, the numbers that the Hamas-run health ministry, Israel and the UN have put out are all very, very close, aligned plus minus 5%. So we rely on the UN, the humanitarian agencies, the human rights organizations, as we do in Ukraine and Syria and elsewhere, and they're pretty confident in those numbers.
Can I ask you, Daniel, because you wrote an important piece for the New York Times, and you laid out a couple of things. One, definitely you called for a ceasefire, but partly to get hostages out. Tell us how you mean and why that would work, or how that would work in the middle of something like this.
So I think what we're seeing at the moment is that the potential on-ramp to a full ceasefire probably runs via a time-limited cessation of hostilities that allows some of the hostages to get out, perhaps then leading on to getting a deal for the rest to get out. I think once it comes to the soldiers being held by Hamas, that will be in a more significant prisoner exchange. And I think what we are perhaps moving towards is that there would be, I think we're now talking possibly 5 days, a 5-day cessation, get out a significant number of those being held, possibly have Palestinian women and children being held in Israeli jails, released in exchange, get a much bigger infusion of humanitarian aid in. But then two things happen, Christiane. And you showed the march inside Israel to get the hostages released, and you've talked about the dynamic in the Israeli internal conversation. And I think two things happen if that first prisoner hostage release happens. The dynamic of the conversation inside Israel shifts, and you have more pressure to get the rest out. And then the choice is clear. It's either the military mission or it's the prisoner release. And the other thing that happens is the outside pressure, which is now accumulating. The West is playing catch up. America and Europe are playing catch up. The rest of the world was there much earlier that this needs to end. But the pressure from the outside, once there is a 5-day cessation, will it be so easy for Israel to resume with this kind of bombardment and killing?
Well, the Israeli people want to see, of course they want their loved ones back, but they do want to see the prosecution of the war as well, and they do want to see Hamas neutralized. So that, and yes, and we pointed out the sort of unease now amongst some of the staunchest allies of Israel. Everybody's talking about if Hamas is destroyed, neutralized politically, militarily, what then? We know that Prime Minister Netanyahu twice has taken, or 3 times has taken the opportunity to speak to American media, each time sort of moving the goalposts on what Israel would do afterwards. First it was, security presence for the foreseeable. Then it was a military envelope that we just heard this weekend. How much appetite is there for that?
Well, I think Israel has gone into this without a clear plan for the morning after. And in order to understand that, I think we need to understand that Israel has largely neglected the idea that one does politics with the Palestinians, one does solution-oriented approaches. And therefore, it's been difficult to get that answer in any kind of clear fashion. Now, I think the most likely outcome is that Hamas will continue to exist. Its military capacity may be downgraded. Politically, it is probably stronger than before. There will still be a Hamas. How conflicts end is when the people of violence eventually find ways out of that. Palestinians are in no hurry to sit down with Israel after the killing of 4,500 children. And of course the Israelis want to see Hamas removed. But that is an almost...
After the killing of 1,400
After the killing of...
children.
They lowered it to 1,200, but it does, the numbers don't matter. It was horrific. So this is the unrealistic part. To expect that a movement embedded in a people who are living without freedom and rights, that there will not be armed resistance. However, the other part of this equation, of course, is what about the Palestinian Authority? What about Abbas? What about this whole other side? And this is what's missing.
Well, this is what I want to ask you, because you have actually worked with them. And you worked, for Yitzhak Rabin, who was the first, to go into this sort of peace process. And then with Ehud Barak, who was the last, practically, to offer a big deal that was rejected by the Palestinians. The United States has called for a revitalized PA, Palestinian Authority, to be the Palestinian leadership, not just on the occupied West Bank, but also in Gaza. Mahmoud Abbas is the head of the PA. He's not a popular figure. He's just not a popular figure at home or certainly not with this current Israeli government. No elections. How do you see Palestinians actually being able to take over politically in a place like Gaza? How do you see the question of militarization or demilitarization working? Is there some kind of interim international mandate to keep security? What?
So, in many respects, it's the continuation of the Hamas question. Why is it that Hamas has grown stronger? And why is it that Abbas has lost credibility, popularity, legitimacy with his own people? And the answer there is that they signed a deal with Israel. What Fatah, what the PLO, what the Abbas-led PA did was to say, no armed resistance, political negotiations, and that will deliver us statehood.
And recognizing Israel's rights.
Recognizing Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward, where are we? 450% increase in illegal Israeli settlers in the West Bank during the time of Oslo. An entrenched occupation, a system of structural violence meted out against Palestinians every day. So the West Bank is a much worse place for Palestinians to live in than it was previously. And they have nothing to show for it. And the idea that you can now heap on the shoulders of these people, bringing them in on an Israeli tank after the devastation with total destruction in Gaza is not realistic. The Palestinians will have to rebuild their political institutions.
What is realistic? What is it?
I'm afraid that the only thing that might be realistic is placing this in a broader approach to solving the actual problem of Palestinian dispossession and statelessness and lack of rights.
But in the meantime, who does the Palestinian guardianship of Gaza, West Bank, the Palestinian people?
I'm not sure you're going to have volunteers for that. I think it may well be the humanitarian agencies that are there for a period of time. Israel is apparently not willing to withdraw. I don't think it would be wise for any Palestinian movement to say, we will do this under the watchful eye of Israel. What happens in the West Bank is that the PA does security cooperation with Israel, but it doesn't get any political progress. And therefore, that security cooperation is hated. It's seen as collaboration. And that's bad for Palestinian politics. It's bad for Israel as well.
Can I ask you this then? You just mentioned, you talked about the settlements and the settlers. As we know, the settlers are a major part of the Netanyahu government. I mean, some people say they pretty much run the ideology of the government. And we've seen the settler violence now since October 7th on the occupied West Bank. But we also have heard that certain settler leaders have said, you talked about the PA doing their best for security there, but trying to stop the funds for that. And even the Israeli defense minister saying, don't do that, we need the PA to keep helping us with security. How bad is that? Are those funds, do you know whether they're still suspended or they're getting...
Some of them are going through. They can't pay all the salaries. I think we've done a disservice to our own seriousness and our own ability to chart a course forward by not taking seriously what the Israelis have been telling us. They have a government with ministers who make no bones. It's not someone's accusing them of being an apartheid state. They wear that badge with pride. They have openly advocated ethnic cleansing. One of the ministers said Gaza should be nuked. By the way, not a smart thing.
He was suspended from cabinet meetings.
He hasn't been fired as a minister. In this country, someone did something stupid. She was fired as a minister, at least that. However, we haven't taken them seriously. And it's time we did take them seriously, because what has been allowed to happen, it's the tail wagging the dog with the settlers for years.
So let me ask you, because you have a US view into this, you're the head of the US Middle East project here. You've seen that Biden is beginning to shift his public stance. You've seen that today there's a big pro-Israel march in Washington, but even within the government, there's the dissent channel at the State Department. Some 400 Foreign Service and others have written, a letter questioning and expressing their disquiet with Biden's closeness to this operation, the military operation. Where does the US stand in this? And we know the US wanted to essentially pivot away from the Middle East and pivot towards China. Where does this leave the United States in terms of being able to have some really serious influence over a really serious post-war political process?
I think the US has that influence. I think it's a problem that, having been given a warning, remember in May 2021, we had a serious escalation. That's this administration. But they decided, they probably thought, oh, good, we've had our mini flare up. We should be good through to November 24. It didn't happen. They parked the question. They continued not being serious. They were busy with an alphabet soup of normalization and I2U2, India, Israel, UAE, USA, corridors with India. They thought this was the way forward. Now we are where we are. I wish the death toll had budged Biden. It seems the opinion polls are what budged Biden. But now I think in private, they are scared of the regional escalation. They see this isn't working well for them. They see they're losing huge credibility in the global south. They want to end it. But if there's too much of a gap between what they're saying in public and in private, the Israelis know how to play with that.
Daniel Levy, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.